In this video, we'll talk a bit more about the impact of reliability on research. And the quality and the meaningfulness of research can be highly influenced by the quality of the measurement procedures that are being used for that research. And therefore, it's important to have awareness of the effect of reliability and what the impact can be on the research results. So in quantitative research, a lot of times we're trying to discover association between variables, and therefore it's really important to determine what are the factors that are really underlying these correlations between two observed scores on two measures. So let's say if you want to know whether an SAT score is associated with academic performance or whether personality similarity is associated with relationship satisfaction, right? It is important to know the direction and magnitude of the association between those two variables. And when you want to know that, right, the correlation is what we want to know. We don't really want to know the observed score correlation, right? We're interested in the true score correlation, right, conceptually. And therefore, the reliability comes in, right, because the more reliable our measure is, right, the more closer our observed score are to the true scores, right? So when we look at the correlation between two variables, right, and we have scores that measure these variables, right, when we look at the covariance, we then also see that we introduce a measurement error term for the observed scores, right? So therefore you can see how the correlation really also depends on the measurement error and the size of the measurement error, right? As an example here, if you look at the reliability, there's two scenarios here, right? One where we have the reliability of higher reliability, and then we have the we have the true scores on the top, right, which correlate 0.40, right? But then if we look at the observed scores, first of all, you notice how there's all scattered out more, and then the correlation is only 0.18, right? So you can see what a difference it makes to if we are doing our studies with observed scores, whereas comparing it to having the actual true scores. So what we can conclude then is that, first of all, right, the measurements are never perfect and they're always affected by measurement error to some degree, right? And so the imperfect measurement weakens, or technical term, attenuates the observed associations, right? So the correlations that we actually observe are typically lower than the actual correlations between the psychological constructs. And the degree of how much lower or how attenuated these measures are, it's the lower the reliability, right, the more attenuated the measurements are. Right, and so therefore when you conduct a study, that's where the reliability becomes more important, right? Because if you have a measure that's less reliable, you might think, okay, it's going to be harder to find correlations and actually document and find support for correlations. So therefore we want to have very reliable measures to be able to find correlations and associations between the variables that we study. So there's four implications here of thinking about reliability in connection with observed correlations. One, the observed correlation will be weaker than the true score correlation. It will be attenuated. This depends on how reliable the measures are, right? And therefore the reliability of the measures limits the maximum association that can be found between measures. And you can also estimate the true score correlation. However, that's not done that frequently, but if you know the reliability, you could technically estimate, hey, if we had a better reliability, how much higher would the actual correlation between the true score, how much higher would that be? So besides the impact on, let's say, correlation, reliability also has an impact on effect size and statistical significance, right? So, like if you have very reliable and measures with a low measurement error, it will be easier to have statistically significant results, and typically also your effect size will be higher. So let's say if you have poor reliability, you're going to have effect sizes that are more attenuated, and the statistical significance will be less likely. If you have good reliability, on the other hand, effect sizes are going to be less attenuated, they're probably going to be more accurate, and statistical significance, on the other hand, becomes more likely. And here you see some formulas, right? And see how the connection is between the reliability, effect sizes, and inferential statistics. And one example here is, look, two scenarios, right? One, there's the same difference here in the test scores, right, between the two studies. But you see here, those are the true scores. They're narrower, right? The observed scores are much wider because there's also error involved, right? And now when we look at if we had the true scores in this scenario, all right, our effect size of a Cohen's d would be 1.52. And on the other hand, when you do the same calculation with observed scores, right, the Cohen's d drops down to 1.07, right? So this is an example of differences in statistical significance and the effect size based on how reliable the scores are. And that's why it's important, the implications for conducting and interpreting behavioral research, right? It's important for the interpretation. You got to consider reliability, and also to try to get as highly reliable measures as possible, right? And then also report the reliability estimates in your articles and research reports, because that gives us an idea of how attenuated your results might be, right?